Hello and welcome to UnHerd. Over the past weekend, there have been disorder, riots, violence across England. Places like Rotherham, Middlesbrough, Liverpool, Bolton, all in theory stemming from the terrible stabbing attack that took place in Southport, but it now has spilled into a kind of wider disorder, and it turns out it's even spread to Northern Ireland. Obviously, they are not strangers to riots and street violence in this part of the world. Throughout the Troubles, 70s, 80s, there were terrible events taking place in these streets in Belfast, but very few journalists from the UK were there to cover it. Our Aris Roussinos was, and he's here to tell us about it. Hi, Aris.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you were there. This is not the normal kind of gang struggles that you might normally see in Belfast. This is a completely different thing going on. Try and explain what's going on to us.
Yeah, so I'm sure you know the background of the Northern Ireland conflict, which is a division between kind of almost equal populations of ethnic Irish, Catholics, nationalists, and local Protestants who identify as ethnic British. So that's the classic Northern Ireland conflict that's defined this country since its existence, really, over a century ago. Since the anti-immigration protests in the South, in the Republic, across the border.
When did they start, just to put us in the picture?
They've been going on for more than a year now, but they really accelerated following the riots in Dublin last winter after the attempted murder of school children by an Algerian migrant. So in a very similar scenario to Southport, actually, that led to an immediate angry reaction from a mixture of, local yobs and angry local people that was unprecedented in modern Ireland. And then there's been ongoing protests in towns and villages where the government have been trying to set up, migrant accommodation centres. So villages or towns like Newton McKennedy or Coolock, essentially anti-government protests as well as anti-migrant. But the actual focus has been against the government, against the Irish police.
And again, that's sort of parallel to what we've been seeing in England for the past couple of days. Attacks on migrant hotels, attacks on the police.
Ireland has a historical tradition of kind of agrarian outrages and kind of anti-governmental violent action against the state that had kind of fed into the modern migrant protests. What we're seeing in England, which I think is influenced by or inspired by Ireland, is moving at a much faster and becoming rapidly much more violent way than anything we've seen in Ireland so far.
Let's start with what you saw in Belfast yesterday and the day before. So there was a planned protest at City Hall against immigration, or who was protesting what exactly?
So looking at local Facebook groups, it was organised by local ethnic British loyalist community, local Protestants who they'd set up blockades blocking the main traffic routes into the city centre. But there'd also been a strong outreach, an attempted outreach at the local Catholic nationalist population. I think inspired by the sense that there's a kind of growing anti-Sinn Féin as well as anti-government dissent against mass migration in the South. I think they want to bring that atmosphere or that kind of sense of anger into Northern Ireland, where it's a different political situation.
I mean, that is, if we could just dwell on that for 1 minute, that is extraordinary, isn't it? To have outreach between the Protestants and the Catholics for a protest in Belfast. I don't know if it's ever happened before, but it feels very new.
There were local Catholics here at the protest. I was talking to an old lady from, a Catholic from rural County Derry who'd come along. The most prominent and the most aggressive and the most vigorous Irish Catholic protesters were from the South. They were at the front of the crowd. I think you probably got video actually of quite a loud Dubliner confronting the pro-migration protesters, who are a mixture of socialist Republican groups, general kind of liberal pro-migration NGOs, pro-Palestine organisations, trade unions, that kind of thing.
And where do they come from? It's an extraordinary gathering of people. So you have this venue of Belfast, this historic centre of ethnic struggle between Catholics and Protestants, and now it's this whole new set of coalitions. So there's anti-immigrant protesters both from the south and from the north, and then where do the kind of anti-immigrant protesters come from? Are they coming from England? Are they coming from the capital?
Over the past few decades, Sinn Féin has, and this is causing tension in the South, Sinn Féin has moved from its kind of traditionalist nationalist Republican ethos into a more social liberal way, in the same way that, left-wing parties or social democratic parties, across Europe have done and have suffered for that with their kind of working class support base, right?
Sinn Féin is considered kind of too progressive by some of its supporters.
So Sinn Féin lost a lot of support in the south in the recent elections from their kind of core base. Like if you look at attitudes to immigration in Irish polling, it's Sinn Féin's core vote who are most vehemently against mass migration. However, the Sinn Féin leadership are extremely committed to a policy of welcoming migrants and other kind of social liberal innovations. And that speaks to tensions that are within the Irish nationalist Republican tradition. There's always been a strong left-wing strand in it and the internationalist. There has also always been essentially a kind of strong right-wing blood and soil, ethno-nationalist aspect to it as well. So these are tensions that are developing within Irish nationalism. But for the moment, in the north, Sinn Féin and Sinn Féin's kind of core base and support structure are still, at least rhetorically, because it's actually Protestant areas that are altered most by mass migration into Northern Ireland from the mainland.
So you're seeing these completely new coalitions forming, and are they actually political movements? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion here about whether this is protest or whether it's just thuggery, whether it's just kind of undirectional violence. Did you get the sense that this was a political organisation, or was this just opportunists who are kind of bored in a summer and want to cause some trouble?
I mean, like any protest or like any right, it's all of those things at the same time. These aren't opposing categories, right? Any demonstration will have thugs that's out to cause destruction. A lot of the violence and destruction is explicitly targeted at their perceived enemies, which in this case means migrants. So in that sense, it's avert political violence, even ethnic violence. There are differing strands to this, and it's still an amorphous movement, right? So in the south, there's no real leadership. It's actually splintered. There's kind of different rival, nascent political parties trying to take control of this movement, like trying to take most of its energy, like for its own purposes. But that hasn't been resolved yet. It's still all very much in place.
So both in South, or in the Republic and in Northern Ireland, who are the political leaders who are most, I suppose, sympathetic to or in listening mode to those kind of groups that are anti-immigration and feel like it's been foisted on them? Are there political leaders for them?
In Northern Ireland, that space does not currently exist within the nationalist or Catholic community. Within the loyalist, Protestant community, that would be represented by the TUV, Traditionalist Unionist Voice, or Traditional Unionist Voice, who are kind of to the right of, I suppose, reform in the UK. So they represent a kind of hardcore loyalist, strong sense of like an ethnic British identity.
One protester you spoke to from Drogheda in the Irish Republic said to you, "This is the best thing that ever happened in this country. Now we can come together against the real enemy." I mean, that's an amazing quote. What does he mean?
I mean, he means non-European, non-white migrants into Ireland. So Ireland has been undergoing a vast immigration wave over the past 20 years, really, but it's accelerated really over the past 5 years. And that's rapidly reshaping the country's demography, and obviously, naturally, as is the case in any society where this happens, it's having a strong counter-reaction that's affecting Irish politics.
How does it compare to England or to Northern Ireland in terms of quantum?
In terms of overall numbers, the South has a vastly greater kind of rate of influx. However, since COVID particularly, the British government has been moving, migrants and asylum seekers from the British mainland into Northern Ireland, where housing costs are lower. Part of a dispersal program that the government's taken on really since Johnson came to power.
Tell us more about what you saw on the ground in Belfast, both in the day where you were attending this protest and then into the evening. What else did you see?
The anti-migrant protest that assembled at City Hall, it was separated from the pro-migration protesters by a line of police, armoured Land Rovers. Obviously, the police in Northern Ireland are much more experienced in dealing with civil disorder and ethnic strife than they are in the UK until now. So they were separated, but the anti-migration protesters, by the end, vastly outnumbered the pro-migration protesters.
What sort of numbers are we talking about?
It's difficult to say, but hundreds at least.
So what are they shouting? What kind of slogans are they shouting? What kind of people are they? What were what you described as pro-migration protesters saying? They were accusing them of being fascists or what? Or what were they saying in return?
Yeah, absolutely. Nazi scum off our streets, fascist, out. Mick Lynch, the trade union leader, had been flown over from London to kind of give a speech about how all the workers should unite against, the big bosses and the media who are stoking these tensions. Everything was exactly as you'd expect.
Well, you say as you'd expect, but what's so interesting is that both sides of this protest are laying claim to be a kind of true working class struggle. You've got Mick Lynch there saying that it's somehow an elite culture war that's being stoked by the right-wing media. And then you have, obviously, working class loyalists on the other side. That also feels interesting and quite hard to unpick.
It's natural in any situation like this for there to be kind of strange ambiguities, where both sides could feasibly claim to be representing shades of each other's opinion. It's not that they are made of coherent opposing blocks, but they each represent shades of opinion and shades of kind of personal identity, constructed identities that are now in fundamental opposition. So they all moved off the the anti-migration protest, moved off to a mosque in South Belfast. The police had blocked off the mosque with armoured Land Rovers and police and riot gear.
The mosque is empty at this point?
No, there were local kind of Muslims guarding it, or inside it, I think. It's not. They call it a cultural centre. In fact, they call it an Islamic cultural centre, even though it's a mosque, and that's a clue to the local sensitivities in this area, which was a Protestant community that's now very rapidly undergone demographic change.
So they call it an Islamic cultural centre, not a mosque, to make it more palatable for the local population.
Yeah, because other attempted mosques in Belfast have been essentially burnt down.
And are they throwing things at this building? What are they attempting to do?
So the police kept a very wide cordon around it, so the process moved off. But because it was being led by a Dubliner who obviously didn't know the city, I guess, it just kind of got waylaid and went down side streets into the student district of South Belfast. What you see in this is the one guy from the south, from Coolock, I think, in North Dublin, who ended up being the ringleader of this march. He's dancing with local loyalists. You can see the waving the British, the Union Jack, the Ulster flag, and the Israeli flag as well, which has become in Northern Ireland a sign of loyalist and Protestant identity in the same way that the Palestinian flag has for local Catholics and nationalists. But that's a whole other issue.
God, this is getting very meta and confusing, isn't it?
You do have this kind of dynamic in some ways developing on the mainland as well, but in a less stark and polarised way, I think. The Israel-Palestine conflict has become a way for people to kind of project their own ethnic identities or anxieties.
And to spell that out for people, it means Israeli flag means you're fighting against the Muslims, basically, and you're in favour of your sort of ethnic homeland remaining majority ethnic. And the reason there are Palestinian flags on the pro-immigration side is because most of the controversial component of the immigrants that people are upset about are Muslims, basically. So there's a proxy there.
No, it also comes from the Irish Catholic historical perception that obviously we are the native population, and then an alien settler population came in and dispossessed us of our land. So the Irish conflict has become overlaid into the Israel-Palestine conflict. What showed the limitations of this ultimately Protestant and loyalist-led attempt to kind of engage Catholics from the south and from the north in this protest was as the process kind of wended its way into what's now a Catholic area in South Belfast, local Catholics waving Palestinian flags very, very angrily confronted them and confronted the police for allowing them to come into our area. So that came you got footage actually of police separating the two angry opposing sides.
So that's like a reversion to the historic sort of grievance.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the anti-migration protesters who'd made every effort to try and make this a kind of non-sectarian Catholic and Protestant event, when this happened, they were shouting UFF, UDA, like the names of prescribed loyalist terrorist groups that are obviously hated by Catholics, but killing Catholic civilians. Once local Catholics and the majority Protestant anti-migration protesters actually interacted in a non-mediated way without the police initially there to kind of mediate between them, then the old Northern Irish ethnic conflict immediately reasserted itself.
So later on that evening, it became a different kind of atmosphere. Tell us about what happened in Sandy Row.
So Sandy Row is a working class Protestant and strongly loyalist community just south of Belfast city centre. It's still dominated by loyalist paramilitary organisations or gangs, and it's very recently been undergoing, as lots of working class Protestant areas have been in Belfast, strongly accelerated demographic change, which is causing tension within this community, which is quite a poor community as well, as suffering housing issues. By the time I got there, locals, they burnt down a Sudanese cafe and barber, huge lines and ranks of armoured Land Rovers, police with baton guns behind shields, kind of sheltering from rocks and fireworks and so on being fired by local youths. I went down to see the youths fighting the police, firing the fireworks. They basically put cars in a barricade and set lights to them to stop the police from entering their area. An interesting mix of kind of local Protestant loyalist disaffection from the Northern Irish state, which they see as being dominated by their local Catholic nationalist enemies now. So people were shouting at the police, go do your Sinn Féin master's bidding, right? Because they see them as being essentially a Catholic-run occupying force now.
Even though they work for the Westminster government ultimately, or at least...
Or the Stormont government.
Well, in theory, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very complicated situation in Northern Ireland. It's getting more complicated every day.
Why were they attacking a Sudanese barber and cafe? You could say that's the most successful kind of immigration, when they've actually set up a business, they're doing something in the community. That's an example of, could almost say, integration.
Even when I was there, while I was there talking to people, they burnt down a Syrian supermarket just opposite a pub called the Royal. The locals drinking outside the Royal were very happy to see it go up in flames. But nearby, there were other ethnic minority shops that hadn't been touched, like Indian shops, Chinese shops. Objectively, I guess, attacking these businesses was racist or Islamophobic or whatever, but it is also targeted violence. They go for some non-local or even non-European communities and not others. And there are a lot of background factors behind this that I think are worthy of deeper analysis.
In Northern Ireland, where you are, there are these now different layers of ethnic conflict and struggle. Should we just read across or make sure we cover the main event, I guess, which is all of the riots and the disorder in England? Do you think it's basically just the same issue, or should we be aware of differences?
Living here emphasises how much it's a different country to the mainland UK. It is a different country. Legally, maybe not, but in its politics and almost every aspect of how politics works here. Politics in Northern Ireland is overtly based around the ethnic conflict in local ethnic Irish, Catholics or nationalists, and Protestant ethnic British, right? That is formally recognised by the British state, and that is the essential basis of politics, is reified by the British state through the ethnic power sharing arrangement, the Stormont Parliament. What we have in England currently, and we're seeing how England addresses these issues in real time. The mainland went in a different way in kind of dealing with people's questions of ethnic self-identity, because the conflict that existed in Ireland and has existed in Ireland for hundreds of years due to demographic change through Protestant settling or migration hundreds of years ago, because that wasn't an issue on the mainland. I think there is no political language for even understanding it. This is very basic social scientific terminology, all the stuff about ethnic conflict, like the ins and outs of it. It seems that people in England, even highly intelligent, educated people, just do not have a mental framework. They just cannot get this idea around their heads, right?
So what you think what we're seeing in England as well is a form of ethnic conflict?
I mean, of course it is.
Will you just detail that for us, just so we understand?
What's happening in England, very clearly, is violent uprising by what is still the majority ethnic British population against the British state, right? They're attacking the police, they're very hostile to the government, press, I'm sure, will soon become targeted, and also against what they see as their ethnic enemy, like an ethnic threat, right? Which is essentially non-British migrants and the descendants of migrants living in Britain. That is objectively what's going on.
You've been a war reporter in Syria and Kurdistan and all over the place. Most parts of the world have ethnic struggles and tensions between different tribes, different people from different backgrounds. And you think what we're seeing with these riots is basically the beginning of England starting to look a little bit like some of those parts of the world?
I live in Northern Ireland, right? I live in a country defined by ethnic conflict. There's formalised ethnic conflict. And obviously the Troubles were terrible and it's caused a lot of damage and, social and psychological harm to people living here. Life goes on. Shops are still open. Schools are still open. Life is like mainland Britain, except these ethnic tensions are open and formalised, right? And society kind of revolves around it. And that is just the nature, ultimately, of the vast majority of multi-ethnic societies, and is a vast corpus of social scientific, research and whatever that explains the ins and outs of it, the mechanics of it, the rationales, potential means of dampening the conflict, or of neutering it as an element, as a major kind of source of political strife, which one would think would be of major interest to commentators and politicians and police and whatever, so on. But because there are still these taboos about discussing it as such, and that also leads back to, I think, it's a historical quirk, I think, that because mass immigration to Britain, when it first happened after the war, came from the Caribbean initially, and also from South Asia. So it came from these kind of post-imperial possessions. It was immediately seen in terms of race. And there was the parallel kind of civil rights movement in the US, which was obviously hugely influential in people kind of developing vocabularies and narratives in terms of dealing with this kind of stuff. So in Britain, uniquely in Europe, because this is absolutely not the case in any other European country, uniquely in Britain, all this kind of concept of ethnicity or ethnic groups or ethnic identity and belonging and stuff like that got subsumed into race.
For people who don't understand the difference, then I might be one of them, explain it. So what you're saying is on the census or on a form, it will give you a list of skin colours rather than sort of cultures of origin. Or what would a more accurate way to sort of describe someone's ethnicity be?
I'm legally British. I was born in Britain, educated in Britain, whatever. My mum was born in Britain. Ethnically, I'm half Irish and I'm half Greek. And that is my ethnic background, right? So I'm ethnically Irish or Greek or both or whatever, depending on context, I guess. To the British state, I'm white other, or I'm white Irish. I would not choose to self-identify as white. It's a meaningless category to me. It's not an important category. It also leads back to this discourse, like, are you saying, that people of migrant background can't be ethnically British? Like, there's lots of discourse about that in the past, and it's still ongoing. It's like, I'm not ethnically British. That doesn't bother me. I don't care, right? I'm not ethnically Japanese either.
Well, how many generations you need to be British before you can become ethnically British?
I mean, of course, like, people in the past have assimilated over time. It's partly a mixture of, kind of intermarrying into the majority population and also kind of losing it. Huguenots, like French Protestants who came over to Britain, after the Reformation, they assimilated into kind of the British or English ethnicity because there is no Huguenot identity anymore. It doesn't exist. It's not meaningful, right? If they were still speaking French and worshipping at like French Protestant churches in Spitalfields or whatever, then it would still be a viable identity, but it's not. So they just became subsumed into kind of, the British ethnos.
Right. So that's one distinction, which is between race and ethnicity, and that would be more accurate and maybe more sophisticated discussion of what's going on to talk about different ethnic groups. It would still basically bring us back to majority white British being one, and various Muslim groups, and I guess some non-Muslim groups being the immigrant groups that those white protesters are upset about. Where does that get us?
It's a dangerous territory, I guess, because there's so many kind of taboos about talking about it. But I do strongly suspect that the focus on race in Britain is in the same way as I think is actually happening in the United States as well. You're not seeing attacks now against, Polish or Lithuanian migrants in Lincolnshire, which is also an example of, significant demographic ethnic change. That's not happening, right? So the racialized discourse that we've experienced and has been hugely promoted by the British state and by the British commentariat over the past few decades is, I think, creating the whole idea of the BAME, I don't know how to pronounce it, identity, as like this kind of
BAME.
coherent thing.
Yeah. BAME stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic.
It's a meaningless category, right? You're assembling people from all kinds of different cultures, all kinds of different ethnic groups, who have all kinds of different beliefs and struggles and hopes and fears and anxieties and aspirations, whatever, into one whole. The only purpose of that category is assembling non-white people together as a political unit. And the opposite, literally the opposite in this racialized binary, this completely imaginary racialized binary, is white people, right? So not just ethnic British, but white people. So I'm included in this category in opposition to the BAME category.
So is what you're saying that what was an attempt to try and dampen down ethnic or racial conflict by creating categories like BAME and trying to simplify things into kind of white, brown, black has actually caused a new set of divisions and hasn't worked at all, because we'd actually be in a better place if people thought of themselves as Irish or English or, you know, from Leicestershire or Liverpudlian or whatever, instead of white predominantly and brown or black predominantly. Is that what you're saying, that it's actually made things worse?
When put next to historically unprecedented demographic change that's happening in the United Kingdom, as is happening across lots of countries in the Western world through mass migration, when you assemble all the migrants together in as big a kind of lump as possible, to essentially get the numbers up as much as possible, to then put in explicit political opposition to the majority ethnic population of the country that, you know, formed the country and the country's named after and so on. That is like, it's the most guaranteed possible recipe for ethnic conflict you could possibly imagine, right? Because you're vastly accelerating the sense of threat that the majority native population of the country have. I'm sure you've heard of the Hebron riots, you know, the 1929 riots in Palestine. So the native Palestinians were feeling threatened by Jewish immigration into Palestine under the British mandate. Jewish numbers had reached up to about 20% of the population by that time. So Palestinians would be very much beginning to worry that they're going to, you know, lose their country because of that. There were rumours, there'd been tensions building before about, you know, access to religious buildings and so on. There were rumours that, you know, local Jews had killed some Arabs. There's no proof, no one knows whether that was even true or not. It doesn't matter if it's true, right? Like, once something like that happens, it doesn't actually matter if there's any basis to it. There's a spark, as there has been here in Southport, and it sets off a conflict in hugely unpredictable ways. So it led to Palestinian pogroms, essentially, against Jews within Palestine, you know, awful atrocities, and then back and forth ethnic mobilization and counter-mobilization against each other. And then the situation in Palestine and what's become Israel has developed as we are aware. But that is a classic example of ethnic conflict through fears of demographic change that then just becomes open, you know, binary hostility.
What is a better way to deal with it? That's the question, because the political right is very clear that their answer is to put an end to mass immigration as step one, and then pretty forcibly integrate the remaining populations as step two. That's the right-wing political solution. Are you suggesting there are other approaches from these other kind of multi-ethnic struggles that we can learn from?
There are other approaches. I don't think many of them are applicable to the UK. Like, I don't think there'd be any appetite for granting political autonomy to majority, you know, Muslim areas of the UK, which is one means to dampen conflict.
I can't see that helping matters.
You could recognise, as you do in Northern Ireland and in Lebanon, you basically set in stone the ethnic conflict, and it's formally recognised by the political system. And each side shares power in a very agreed and kind of demographically arranged way.
The thing is that the numbers we're talking about, even despite the huge uptick in immigration, the numbers we're talking about aren't comparable to Lebanon or Israel. I mean, we're talking about, what is it, 6%, 7% Muslim in England?
We're pretty sure that the instigator of the attack, the attacker in Southport, he wasn't Muslim. He comes from a Rwandan, presumably Christian Rwandan family. I think Tommy Robinson, he's not orchestrating this, but what he has done as he's shifted a demographic anger over immigration generally, it's appreciable, or like there's very strong evidence all across the country, but he's turned it towards a specifically anti-Muslim direction, which has more resonance in northern post-industrial towns for their own reasons. And that's also been brewing in the background for a long time. So it shifted from one potential kind of ethnic conflict to another, if that makes sense. And I think Robinson has been absolutely paramount in making that happen.
So I guess the question has to be, where does it go from here?
Unlike a lot of kind of conservative commentators or whatever, I don't think it's going to be a civil war or anything like that. I think the riots will fizzle out. I think the state will reassert its control. I think it will be a more coercive state with greater restrictions on free speech. There's going to be a lot of calls for people to kind of dampen the rhetoric, and it's people who support essentially unlimited migration saying any anti-migration rhetoric is harmful and causes this. But if this is, and it is, a direct response to Britain's kind of immigration experience over the past few decades, then all the immigration maximalists, all the people kind of triumphantly pushing this forward and kind of silencing any debate in it, calling anyone with any skepticism at all about migration, racist or fascist or whatever. These people are just as culpable morally, and I would like to think legally, actually, personally, for the violence that's ongoing now, because they've also vastly accelerated what's happening.
Aris Roussinos, thank you. That was Aris Roussinos, a long-standing contributor to UnHerd, a former war reporter, someone who's seen real ethnic conflict across the Middle East, in Syria, in Kurdistan, and now lives in Belfast, where he's been telling us about a whole new set of coalitions and a whole new kind of ethnic conflict that, by his account, is coming to the United Kingdom more generally. Quite sobering thoughts from Aris. Thanks to him. Thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.